If you have watched our previous webinars, then I'm sure you are familiar with these faces. But for those who do not know who these speakers are, let's meet them. Zane Earlywine has been our account executive at Netronom for 4 years and currently serves in the 130th Airlift Wing in Charleston. A fun fact about Zane is that he loves to bass fish. And then Paul Page is our solutions engineer at Netronom. He has over 30 years of IT industry experience and has worked for Netronom for over 16 years. A fun fact about Paul is that he loves to coach and play hockey. And before we get into it, I just want to kind of have a little rundown and agenda of today's webinar. So we're going to have Zane, and Zane's going to discuss with us what is the cloud and SaaS. And what SaaS is software as a service. And like I said, Zane will get more into that in just a second. But we're going to have him explain what is the cloud and what is SaaS. And then we're going to go into these 4 critical dangers that you need to know about the cloud. We're going to talk about compliance. And as I mentioned before, just because you store professional information or data in the cloud does not mean that you are 100% compliant. We're going to talk about disaster recovery, how there are issues with the cloud. It's not going to, you need to have a backup for your backup. We're going to talk about security and then reputation because not all cloud softwares or platforms are the same. And then again, we're going to have a dedicated Q&A. So again, feel free to ask any questions at any time. And I'm going to hand it over to Zane, who will discuss what is the cloud and what SaaS is. Zane?
Yeah, thanks, Lena. Yeah, so we'll get right into it because there's a lot of people that I've met that really just don't have any idea of what the cloud truly is. When you say cloud and all your data is going to be stored in the cloud, you're like, well, where is it? Well, it's still residing somewhere physical. It's still residing in servers that's somewhere. It's usually like a server farm or database that's somewhere, maybe, in Utah or Pennsylvania. But when we talk about the cloud, it refers to internet-based software and services, and that data is being backed up in the cloud. It's stored across multiple servers and locations, and it's managed and delivered by whoever that host is. And it's delivered as you need it. You reach out and request that information, and it's sent back to you from the cloud. And whenever you input it, it inputs it from your network or your machine to the cloud, to those servers. It involves storing and accessing your data and applications over the internet instead of on your own computer's hard drive or on a server or somewhere that resides locally within that network. Some examples of this, Facebook or all social medias is actually one. A lot of people don't really think about it like that. But if you just take a second, you have, most people have like Facebook, the application on their phone, they open it up. Facebook does not actually live on your phone. All the data that's stored and there for your profile and everything, that does not live on your phone. That is stored on Facebook's servers or wherever they are hosting all of their servers. Same with OneDrive, especially like OneDrive, it's the file storage, but it's cloud-based through Microsoft. That, once again, when you put it in OneDrive, it no longer resides on your computer. Yes, you can access it from your computer, but it is ultimately stored in Microsoft's data farms or their servers. And then QuickBooks Online as well. You go to a URL to go to QuickBooks Online and do all of your accounting work on there. That data, once again, does not live within your network or on your computer. It is hosted on their servers, and they are managing and maintaining that for you. Next, we'll talk a little bit about software as a service. So software as a service and cloud, they're kind of one and the same, but when we talk about SaaS or software as a service, we typically think of a service that we are paying for. It's a web-based model where software providers host and maintain the servers, much like the cloud, and those databases. Some examples of popular software as a service applications include like Microsoft 365. You have all your Teams messaging, all your email, your OneDrive. All of that is being hosted and maintained for you on Microsoft servers as a service. It's a software as a service. Google Workspace, same thing. Salesforce, a popular CRM tool. Once again, that is something that you're paying for. You're paying for that service, that software, and they are hosting all of that for you. And then once again, QuickBooks Online is another example of that, where you are paying for that software, you're paying for that service, and it is being hosted for you via the cloud. And next, I'm going to hand it over to Paul, who is going to talk about the first two dangers you should know about when we are talking about the cloud.
Great. Thank you, Zane. Thank you, Alina. Glad everybody's here today talking about some really important topics. Cloud's coming out there and everybody's kind of wondering to move to the cloud, not to move the cloud, what's good, what's bad, all that stuff. So really an important topic for us to kind of cover today. And so we want to talk about compliance in the cloud, let's say. So one of the common things that we've got to be aware of, whether you're under HIPAA compliance or PCI or NIST or any of the safeguard rules, all of those kind of have a common core about them. And really, it's about protecting the privacy, security, and also the availability of the data that we have stored in the cloud. So a lot of things that we're going to talk about is going to refer to like our cloud vendors. When we're talking about cloud vendors, and what I mean by cloud vendors, that can be Amazon Web Services or AWS. You might have heard of some of these. Microsoft Azure, is another one. And then, of course, the Google Cloud. We've got a whole lot of different cloud vendors out there. Those are some of the top tier ones. One thing that we need to notice, though, is that they are not fully responsible for keeping your data compliant. What they typically do is AWS, Azure, Google, they will provide that platform and that infrastructure. They're going to provide the physical security of your hardware that's housing that data in the cloud. So if you think about that, we've got these data centers, and they're usually on, East and West Coast data centers. They're storing maybe your applications and your data. So I want you to think about it as when we're talking about compliance, it's not just them taking care of your compliance. Now, with that said, there are industry specific providers that can assist and provide those resources and tools to help you become close as you can to compliance in the cloud. But we want to think of it as a shared responsibility. And that's kind of the model that we see with most of the providers out there. They're going to provide this physical security to get into the data centers. They're going to provide the hardware and the technology that makes best effort to keep the bad guys out of your data. We're in the cloud. They've got to have some sort of defense against the internet users that want to get to your data in the cloud. So they're going to provide a lot of that in there, what we refer to as a firewall. That's your first line of defense against all the threats. Well, those cloud providers are going to provide that firewall for your data that's in the cloud. Again, that's part of the infrastructure and the physical security. On the shared responsibility model, the user, those that access the data, your organization, your company that's getting to that data that's in the cloud, whether that be PHI, protected health information, or PII, personally identifiable information, whatever that sensitive data is in the cloud, it does boil down to you ultimately being responsible to protect that data. So you're going to be doing things like who can access that application or that data in the cloud. What staff members can access it? What level of permissions do they have? Can they make changes to the data? Can they delete it? Can they just view it? Those kind of things. So that really, under the shared model, that's how that's going to happen. The cloud vendor is going to provide these levels of physical security infrastructure, and then the users are going to provide that who can access the data, what permissions are given to that data. So with that said, there's also one of the things that I hear a lot of times when we visit clients, is specifically, when we're talking about HIPAA, they have been told by their providers of that data and that application that their data in the cloud is HIPAA compliant. While that may be true, you have to keep in mind that if you're accessing that data, you still have to make sure that all of your equipment and your computers or your devices that are accessing that cloud, that they are compliant as well. Because if you think in this regard, what if somebody was actually able to hijack your computer, your laptop? They've gotten access to your laptop. Then they have access to the data that you've put up in the cloud if you've saved your passwords, or they guess your passwords, or they run a brute force, all of those things that can happen. So that is why it's important not to believe that just because your data is in the cloud, I don't need to do any compliance of my stuff that I got back here locally. And that's just not true. We want to take best effort to make sure that we've got antivirus on our local machines that is connecting to that data in the cloud. I hope that makes sense. Cloud compliance services. The one thing I wanted to talk about this is if you're going to be choosing a cloud provider, you want to make sure they have some level of certifications. SOC 2 and ISO 2700, 27001 are the two most common ones that we see out there. And what that really is when we're talking about SOC, it's just system and organization controls. It's an audit that's performed on that data center or that provider that says that they have met a certain level of expectations to keep your data secure. So always, if you're looking at, make sure if you're looking for cloud services, make sure they have some designation that they've gone under some stringent audits and they've met a certain level of expectations to keep your data safe. So when we're talking about steps to take, first thing you want to do is you want to understand the regulations. Make sure you know what's required in HIPAA or PCI if you're in accounting realm or any of the other compliances. They all kind of have a lot of the same requirements and regulations within them, but make sure you fully understand the ones that are related to you. So you want to define your policies and procedures. You want to say only these staff members can do this type of work, or I want to make sure that we are keeping all of our data safe by this procedure. They have to have, awareness training. That would be part of your policy. All staff members have to have awareness training. Again, you want to choose compliant vendors that have that SOC or ISO industry specific audit expectations that are set. Access controls is really important. Who can get to that data? We kind of talked about that a little bit there. Securing your data and your local devices that access that data. So you want to make sure, like I had mentioned, that you're protecting yourselves as well as watching out for that data that you have in the cloud. And then, of course, this is a dynamic process. You always want to be reviewing your policies and procedures. You always want to be monitoring and auditing your level of compliance. And they change. Those compliance requirements may change from year to year, time to time. So it's a dynamic process. It's always ongoing. And in summary, while many cloud vendors can provide that service to support or the tools, the resources to help you with compliance, ultimately is the responsibility of the owners of the data. And that would typically fall under your organization. You own that data, not the cloud provider. All right, so let's talk a little bit about disaster recovery. Again, we have in compliance regulations for most of those ones that we just looked at, HIPAA, PCI, NIST, FTC safeguard rules, they all indicate that you have to have this disaster recovery policy procedures in place. You need to have a disaster recovery plan. And we refer to that as the BDR. You have to have backup and disaster recovery plan. So when we're looking at that, the requirements for that are the same throughout most of those compliance regulations. So what's the difference in our local data? If we have data locally on our machines and how we have to back that up, and cloud data that may be in the cloud and how we back that up. Really, there's no difference because all of the same threats that could affect you locally, if you, like say you had your server and your data on site, those same threats that we're worried about are the same ones that the cloud providers have to worry about as well. So you want to take the same types of actions for both of those. You want to make sure you have disaster recovery plan in place for your cloud data as well. A lot of people think, well, my stuff's up in the cloud. I don't really have to back it up because Microsoft is taking care of that or Google is taking care of that. And I'll just tell you that, they are going to take best effort, your cloud vendors or your providers. They're going to make best effort to keep your stuff secure. But we know things can happen. I won't mention the vendor, but we've had instances 3 years ago, about 300,000 people lost all of their email at one of the big providers. So it's important to recognize that although your providers or your vendors are going to be doing some backups for you, we recommend at Netron, obviously, that we do a secondary backup through a third-party solution. Just so you know, in the event that something happens, we've got this other set of backups that are out there that we can recover from. All right, so are they all foolproof? No, we know that all of it's not foolproof. It's, things can happen out there. We're still susceptible to, attack from the cyber criminals or even human error. We accidentally go in there and delete a bunch of data accidentally. So we know that those same threats exist, whether it's local or in the cloud, and you need to take best effort at all of that. And some of the best practices when we're talking about that, use a solution that keeps backups in more than one geographic location. We want stuff on the East and the West Coast data centers. And again, we want to have those data centers that have reached a certain level of expectations to keep your data safe. The SOC that we talked about and the ISO, those are stringent third-party audits that we want to make sure are keeping our backups safe out there as well. They should be automated with alerting. You get notified in case they don't happen or that they are happening. We want to use immutable backups. And what I mean by immutable is those backups that are that can keep us safe from ransomware, malware, viruses, all of those threats that are out there. They're immutable backups. Testing the solution regularly is really important. We want to test that. We want to restore a file, create a file, or just a test file, put it in there and then restore it and see if you can restore that file. A lot of that can be automated, with a lot of solutions out there that can be automated. And again, awareness of changes that could affect your solution. Again, it's dynamic. Threats are ever evolving. And so we want to make sure that we're, aware of that. We're keeping up to date with the latest threats that are out there and steps that we have to take to kind of stay up to date on our disaster recovery plan. I hope that helps everybody. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Zane so we can talk about our next two topics.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, that was awesome. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit about security, and it's kind of a funny thing as I've gone around and met with all kinds of different businesses and leaders throughout the state and our tri-state region. There is two conflicting myths, I guess, about the security of operating in the cloud. Some assume that if we're using the cloud, it's completely vulnerable. But part of that reason why is because it's a loss of control. We're moving that data to the cloud, and it can feel like we're losing control of that data. And ultimately, just a lack of knowledge of what the cloud really is. And then a fear of change. Adopting a new technology, it can be intimidating, especially if you don't have an IT provider or a person to kind of hold your hand through that process and talk you through it. And ultimately, you're entrusting sensitive data to a third-party provider, whether that's actually the data itself, or maybe they're hosting an application for you that you rely on for your business function. So, it can be a little bit scary, but the other side of it is people assume that the cloud is completely secure without any other additional precautions on their side. And that is also not the truth. Some things we have to look out for is like access management. Paul kind of touched on a little bit, but not properly controlling who can use cloud resources can ultimately lead to unauthorized access. And then, often that sensitive data is traveling between your local network, the computers on your network, and to the cloud. So ensuring that we have that local network security is going to help protect that data during transmission. We still need to have a firewall at our office. We still need to be using antivirus. We still need to have endpoint detection and response. We still need to have that spam filtering in our email. All those same precautions as if we had a server on site. We still need to have all those. We're just not going to have to worry about the server itself. So we still need to have all of those things in our mind. And then also breaches. It can still happen even in the cloud. That unauthorized access to those cloud resources could ultimately lead to the data manipulation or deletion. So that's important, like Paul had mentioned, that we have a backup disaster recovery plan in place just in case something like that does happen. And then ultimately, breaches can lead to the theft of your login credentials. So if you have a breach there internally on your computer, it's very likely that the attackers will be able to access your cloud applications and services. I know a lot of people, they use their Google Chrome and they log into their EHR, their QuickBooks Online, and they have a million passwords, so they just go ahead and save their username and password whenever they log in. So that way, every time they go in there, they can just click a button, they can log in. They don't have to remember the password. Well, if a hacker hijacks your computer, and a lot of times, 80% of the time, they're doing it after hours now, they are able to go in there, simply go to that application. You probably even have it pinned right there on the side because you go to it so often. Click on that. All right, click this. Automatically populates. Okay, they're in. Now they can do whatever they want to with that data. They can completely export it. They can delete it. They can manipulate it and ultimately hold you ransom with that data, even though it is in the cloud and they're doing their best efforts. But since you didn't take your best efforts there internally, you have now fallen victim. And then also we have to think about the insider threat as well. It's not as common, but it certainly does happen. So we need to think about that as far as our employees and what access they have to these cloud systems. Ultimately, they could misuse their privileges. And this might be on accident. They may accidentally go in there and unknowingly delete something that they shouldn't. Or you could have an employee and maybe they're fired and they get disgruntled. One thing about cloud applications and services, and it's a nice thing about it, but we can access those from anywhere. So if they can just get on their laptop at home, put in their login credentials, and then get into the portal, now they can do whatever they want to with that data. So it's important to have, as we mentioned, policies and procedures in place for when things like that happen. But like I said, not super common that we have to worry about these malicious insiders, but it certainly does happen. We hear about it probably a handful of times, half a dozen times throughout the year, where we have had some malicious insider threats that's hurt an organization. And then next we'll talk a little bit about reputation. And one myth out there about that is that, and Lena kind of mentioned, that all cloud providers offer the same level of reliability. Once again, not completely true. Now, there's tons of great options out there for cloud services, and there's tons of different cloud services that we can utilize out there. But it's important that if we're going to be moving either our data to the cloud, or if we're going to be using, once again, an application that we need for our business function, that we are kind of vetting these vendors, that we make sure that they have a good reputation, that it's not just some, knockoff company that's over in Bangladesh or wherever they may be, and nobody's ever heard of them. But the pricing's great. Of course it's great, because it's a terrible service. So those are things that we have to think about. You probably want to set up demos as well, and then kind of vet through that process and reach out to your IT provider or whoever's helping you with IT to kind of hold your hand through that process. We want to think about, the architecture and design of the application itself. It's going to play a crucial role. The design of that application, if it's not designed with redundancy and failover mechanisms, then it won't be nearly as reliable as some others. And also, different applications come with varying SLAs or service level agreements, which is going to define the expected uptime and performance of that software application. And they can vary significantly between applications and providers. So that is something that you would want to ask as you are setting up your meetings and your discovery meetings with these cloud software providers, is talking about these SLAs, these service level agreements, and whoever is taking care of your IT should also be kind of talking about those things as well. And then also consider their maintenance on their servers and everything. The regular maintenance and timely updates can affect the reliability of those services. And some applications may experience more frequent downtime due to updates. So something to consider. And then also, once again, if we're using somebody who is not a reputable source for these cloud hosting services, then they may also have human error or accidental deletions. The people that they have maintaining and working on their servers may not be the people that you would want maintaining and working on your servers if you had that server in-house. So it's something to think about, because you could still fall victim to those accidental deletions or misconfigurations, which could ultimately lead to data loss. And there's not too much you could do about it at that point. Once again, as we've seen, these providers are also not completely unsusceptible to ransomware or zero-day attacks or account hijacks. All these other things that we have to worry about internally, they also have to worry about. Now, they probably have a lot more resources and money to put towards that to protect that information. But once again, if we're dealing with somebody, if we're relying on somebody to provide this service or this application, and they're not reputable, and they're just spending as little money as they possibly can to make this work, well, then they might not be spending enough money to keep you protected in the way that you should be. So something to consider. Then also, once again, if they are hiring employees who are cheap employees, they're not reputable, they could have insider threats or malicious activities by their employees, which could ultimately result in data breaches or data loss for you. And then ultimately, once again, if we have some people who are working who are just not knowledgeable enough to be doing the work that they are doing, so bugs or glitches in the software could end up leading to data corruption or loss. And then also the misconfiguration of the networks on their side. The incorrect settings could create vulnerabilities that lead to data loss or data breaches. And then there's some real examples that we've had in the past. There's a lot of them out there actually, but some of the ones that you may or may not have heard of, like Canva back in 2019. It's a popular graphic design tool. A lot of people love it. It's a great tool, but they did experience a data breach affecting 139 million users back in 2019. And the breach exposed email addresses, usernames, passwords, all that information that all those 139 million users did not want out there. And then in 2020, there was a secure email provider, VF Email, and it was hit by a destructive cyber attack that wiped out all their data from the US servers, including its backups. So all that information that was stored there on the secure email servers, completely gone. Nothing anybody could do about it. And then in August of 2023, Cloud Nordic, which is a Danish or was a Danish hosting firm, they suffered a ransomware attack, and it resulted in the loss of the majority of their customers' data, and ultimately forced the company to shut down all systems because they were not able to recover any of the data because they had some oversights on their end whenever they were trying to do a swap over of their systems, and there was kind of just an oversight of how this data was being backed up, and the threat actor was able to get in there and affect that, and ultimately resulted in the loss of tons of data and the loss of that company. So it does happen. It absolutely does happen, and we need to make sure we are considering the reputation of the companies that we are working with.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Zane. This is great. I mean, this is great information. If you are currently using the cloud, but that could be personal, whether that's you have an iPhone and you use iCloud. I know I do that personally, or maybe you use Microsoft OneDrive. And I think it's a great realization, whether it's personal, professional, or both, that the cloud is great, but sometimes it's not going to, like you had mentioned, you can have data breaches and you can have data that is just lost. And so it's always great to have an extra step of security, an extra side of protection for whether it's personal or professional data. So yeah, thank you guys so much for that. So if anybody has any questions, please again feel free to ask in the Q&A section. We do have one question, and I'm going to give this to you, Zane. How do I know if I can move to the cloud?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we get that pretty often here as a lot of people are trying to move to the cloud. The first thing you got to look at is the line of business applications that you are using and whether or not they have themselves a cloud hosted or an online version, like QuickBooks Online, for example. Depending on which version of QuickBooks you are currently using and what you are using QuickBooks for, yeah, you could probably move to QuickBooks Online. Some people cannot. But so those are the things we're going to have to take a look at. You're going to probably want to consult with whoever is taking care of your IT because they can help set up the demos for you. They can kind of hold your hand through the process. And then ultimately, there's some other options where we could actually, even though you have a server on site, but you don't want to have to pay to maintain that anymore because servers are getting pretty expensive. There's a lot of reputable companies out there who will actually host server space for you to run that application if they do not have that provider, that application does not have their own online version or cloud version, that you can actually host that with like Microsoft Azure or AWS. And there's a lot of other different providers out there. But you'll obviously want to have somebody help you through that transition because obviously we're going to have to migrate all the data that's currently on your local network, on your local servers, and move it over to the cloud. And even if that provider does have their own online or cloud version, once again, we're going to have to be doing those things. And we want to make sure we properly plan for that. There have been many cases where I've talked to people and they're like, oh yeah, we decided to move to the cloud 3 months ago. And we started to sign up for everything, and it's just been a headache. We have not been able to get anything done. So that's why it's important to have somebody who kind of knows a little bit about how that process takes place, like your IT provider, to kind of hold your hand through that process and then just make sure that it gets finalized the way it does, someone to kind of go to bat for you, and ultimately make sure that that product actually does work well in the cloud as well. Because there's cases as well where you do have an on-site server with this application that works great, and then they have a cloud offering, you move to it, turns out terrible. But if you have a good IT provider, IT person, they'll be able to kind of pinpoint that for you before you fall victim to it.
Yeah, thanks, Zane. One part that you brought up is, say, for example, if you're a company that's 15 years old and that's 15 years of data. And so if you're trying to take all of that information, all of that data, and put it in the cloud, that's a bit of a heavy process. So you definitely don't want it to go in there and then end up having issues and it becoming a big headache. So having a professional who knows how to transfer data like that, especially a lot, and the right steps and procedures to go is definitely beneficial, I'd say. It's kind of like renovating a house, you think, well, I can tear down that wall until you tear it down and you realize, oh, it's actually low bearing. What do I do now? So it's definitely, I think, important to just get it done once and get it done right. The next question we have, Paul, I'll give this one to you. We're talking about the cloud, but can you give us what are some advantages and what are some disadvantages of using the cloud?
Yeah, so that's definitely a great question. If you're at that crossing where you're thinking of moving your services to the cloud, obviously you want to do some research or get with a reputable IT company to help you and guide you through that process. But some of the advantages that you're going to get are a lower total cost of ownership. That's the first one. You're not going to have this expensive hardware servers like Zane had mentioned in-house. You're going to actually be paying typically it's going to be a recurring monthly fee for your services in the cloud. So it's really an advantage to lower that TCO, or your total cost of ownership. Now, I'm not saying that's going to lower your entire expenditure number, because the cloud services are still expensive as well, but you're not going to have to keep that as part of your budget, that every 5 to 7 years you're going to have to make this $20,000 investment for this new hardware to keep your stuff in-house. So lower TCO is one. Another advantage of using the cloud is it's essentially a work from anywhere solution with internet. So as long as you've got internet, you can connect to that data that's up in the cloud. Now, again, we want to have some security measures in place. Maybe you have a VPN connected back to your office and it's protecting that encryption, detect all of those things that Zane talked about for security. You still want to have that there. But essentially, if you can get to the internet, you can get to your data in the cloud. Those are a couple of the advantages. So alternately, on that same side, disadvantage, if you lose your internet, you're going to lose productivity. You will not be able to access your data in the cloud if you don't have internet at let's say at your company location. If someone hits a pole and knocks down the internet, you would have to scramble and maybe go out to some other locations that have internet, but it definitely could affect your productivity if your internet goes down. And you want to make sure too that you have a strong internet connection. Working with applications in the cloud, you need to have a good internet connection. If you're having a whole lot of drop packets, which means little breaks in your internet connection, it's going to cause you productivity loss at the very minimum with your cloud application. So those are kind of some of the disadvantages that we talk about when we're looking at the cloud.
Yeah, and I would say something else to think about too is it ultimately depends a lot on what industry you're in as well. Like if you're a manufacturing industry and you can run everything internally on that local network without internet, well, maybe you should stay on site with a server, because at that point, if you're cloud-based and you're a manufacturing company, the internet goes out, power's still on, everything still works. You just can't get to all that data that you need to work. Well, obviously that's a big loss. Same with like medical facilities, for example, like a dentist office. If internet goes out there and all your stuff's hosted in the cloud, well, you can't get to any of your patient records or anything else, so you might not be able to
if you're
really
writing
work
it on
anymore.
paper.
Yeah. I mean, you could get around it, but it's going to definitely cause some productivity loss. So that's another case where you might think about, well, maybe it'd be nice to have a server here, so that way we have that local survivability, even if internet goes out.
Thank you for joining us today, and feel free to take a screenshot of this slide. It just has our information. And if you have any other questions, maybe you think of a question, tomorrow or tonight even, it's like, man, that'd be a great question to ask. I know Paul and Zane and myself would be more than happy to answer your question. And if we don't know the answer, we'd be more than happy to ask someone who does. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and be on the lookout. We try to have these webinars monthly, and so we're planning for one as well in May. And again, just trying to keep it around the 45-minute range. So be on the lookout for next month's topic. And that's all we have for today. So thank you so much, everyone.